So I'm going to get started, and I don't know, we're really going to be focusing on something that I have come to recognize over the last 25, 30 years of studying, which are the distinct voices around women in the Talmud. And so we're going to go back 2,000 years, and I'm interested on some of the impact it has with regard to women's roles in society and as well female sexuality. So we're going to be looking at both of those. And then hopefully by then, I know I don't have that much time, 50 minutes, I think, and then some Q&A. I hope it's 50 minutes from when I start. Then some Q&A to really give you a sense of the process around women's roles, what has really become today a critical look at the role gender plays in Jewish spaces, in Jewish identity. So we're gonna try to get a handle on all of that. What I want to go back to is this question around three different voices in the Talmud that speak of women, and of course these are broadly presented, but I think all texts around women can fit into one of these three categories. So in part one, I call it women are a separate people. And really what we're going to see here is an othering of women. The idea of woman as distinct and other from man. The Talmud is written by men, really for men. It's very androcentric, very much from the male perspective. These are texts that, even though they talk about women, are being written by men. That's more or less the case throughout history until relatively recently. And the Talmud is no exception. And so in this section, we have some of the more offensive sources. I always say that as a bit of a warning. Sources that look at women as other, as secondary, as less than. So let's take a look at the first source. I'm bringing a text from Ben Sira. Ben Sira is from the late Second Temple period. He becomes codified into a book in the Apocrypha. He does not make it into what we call the canon, but the rabbis know of Ben Sira. He is part of a collection of wisdom literature in the same way that Proverbs, that Mishlei is. It will sound actually very similar to Mishlei. However, they don't need more wisdom literature. In other words, Ben Sira is not a problem in terms of his religious character or moral fiber. It's just that he's somewhat redundant. Nonetheless, we're even going to see here a way in which Ben Sira comes into the Talmudic text. A daughter is to a father a treasure of sleeplessness, and the care of her banishes slumber. Over your daughter keep a strict watch, lest she make you a name of evil odor, a byword in the city, and the accursed of the people, and shame you in the assembly of the gate. Now, what's really missing, for lack of time, I don't bring the longer text, but right before this, it talks about a son being a source of pride, because if you discipline your son well, your son will grow up and bring pride and honor to his father. The contrast is the daughter, who's a treasure of sleeplessness. And she's a treasure of sleeplessness because her sexuality is an incredible concern to her father. Her celibacy, her chastity, her virginity, the idea that her father remains responsible for marrying her off and can only hope and pray that she will not run off with the milkman from across the road and destroy all his hopes of a significant bride price that will bring money into the family and honor into the family. So all of this is really about her virginity, that she's a treasure of sleeplessness, lest she make you a name of evil odor. Because if she, lo aleinu, chas v'shalom, gets married, and her husband discovers she is not a virgin, this is Dvarim 22, I believe, then he can bring her to the assembly of the gate. And if he can prove that she is not a virgin because there's no sheet with bloodstains on it, then she is stoned to death. And she is stoned to death because of the shame she has brought on her father. And so that's what Ben Sira is talking about. Now, I said these are the most difficult sources. Please wait. We're going to have positive sources as well. But there is a real anxiety over unrestrained female sexuality. And it is seen in really a few places. Number one, the virgin daughter before she gets married, the fear over her seduction. Her assault clearly will not be her fault if she's assaulted. Nonetheless, the father will bear a burden and a price if that happens, even though he'll be compensated. But the seduction of the virgin, and then the divorcee and the widow, in a different way, pose a tremendous threat to society because they are not virgins. They have less to lose when it comes to sexual promiscuity. And so that too poses a threat to society. Female sexuality must be disciplined. It must be kept in order for male society to operate in a spiritually authentic way. And there's a lot of fear around that. Okay, next source. Within marriage, of course, sexuality, female sexuality will be celebrated. I gave a talk on that several months ago. I say it cautiously because it's not 100% true, but there is more celebration or at least acknowledgement of female rights, sexual rights, and female sexuality. But outside of marriage, female sexuality is very threatening. It is reported that a daughter was born to Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe. So Rabbi Judah the Prince is the editor of the Mishnah, very significant sage from a very wealthy family, and he has a granddaughter. And it seems to be the first child born to his son, and he was upset. Rabbi Shimon is upset, and his father tries to comfort him by saying, propagation has come to the world. There will be rejuvenation and reproduction because your daughter has a womb. And as a result, she'll be able to bear beautiful Jewish children. So you should be happy. Bar Kapara, who is standing nearby, says, your father has consoled you with meaningless consolation. As it is taught, the world cannot endure without males and females. Fortunate is he whose children are males. Woe to him whose children are females. And so it's a very honest moment on the part of Bar Kapara that really a father wants sons. He wants sons who will sit next to him in synagogue, sons he can raise to be Torah scholars, sons who can work the farm or the family business. What is he going to do with a daughter? He then has to worry about her virginity. He has to marry her off to another family and negotiate a bride price. And let's be honest, once she's married, she crosses over to the husband's family, and there's very little gain to be had long-term from the birth of a daughter. And I'll just say, while this, thank God, is foreign to us today, and people rejoice in the birth of healthy children, I can say, as someone who had 4 daughters and no sons, it was not so simple. By the 3rd daughter, my husband had already accepted we weren't having any sons, but he was deeply disappointed with the first 2 daughters. He loves them. He's been a wonderful father, but my husband comes from a Western world, so it's a little bit better. But I can say I have heard of men when they hear they're having a daughter, a 2nd daughter, no son, can become very verbally aggressive. This idea of failure, less manliness, and so on. So we think that this is very patriarchal. It is, but in certain societies, there is still a sense of failure if a man does not have a son. I will say today we understand women want to have daughters also to commiserate with and to raise and all the things women like to do. But this is not as far away as we would like to think. Rebbe tries to console by saying, look, she's a beautiful little girl and she'll bear many children. And Bar Kapara gets it. Okay, next source. The next source is also somewhat surprising. I put it in my book, and my friend, Rabbi Dr. Josh Amaru, who did a lot of the content editing, he called me. He's like, are you sure you want to put this source in? I said, yes, I do, because it's very important for me that we not apologize or veer away or erase the more complicated sources around gender. They're there. There's an othering of women, which is going to continue to have impact even today. The idea that somehow women are less, or there's an inferior status to woman, capital W, or something threatening, continues to permeate very traditional spaces. And so I think it's important to own them. This source is going to surprise us because it sounds very Christian. And of course, early Christianity and late Second Temple, early Rabbinic Judaism are not that far apart from one another. And this one is really going to be about original sin and where original sin hits us in our religious lives. Rabbi Yoshua, it's a very long midrash, and Rabbi Yoshua is asking why women are different than men. It's a whole series of questions. Why does a man come forth at birth with his face downward while a woman comes forth with her face upward? Of course, anyone who has witnessed births of boys and girls knows that that's absolutely ridiculous. It's not that boys consistently come forth downward and girls upward. That's ludicrous. Most babies are meant to be born face downward. That's a much more comfortable position for birth, and there's no distinction. But Rabbi Yoshua is talking about gender differences, and he's observing out loud, well, why are there these differences? And it allows him to come up with various explanations for how from the moment of creation, women and men are fundamentally different. They're born out of different substances. Men are born from dirt, from the dust of the earth. Women are taken from the rib, right? Already a secondary status. Women are more shrill. Women are all sorts of distinctions. Why does a man go out bareheaded while a woman goes out with her head covered? She is like one who has done wrong and is ashamed of people. Therefore, she goes out with her head covered. Why do women walk in front of the corpse at a funeral? They brought death into the world. Therefore, they walk in front of the corpse. Why was the mitzvah of menstruation given to her? Because she shed the blood of Adam by causing his death. Therefore was the precept of menstruation given to her. Why was the precept of challah dough given to her? She corrupted Adam, who was the dough of the world. Why was the precept of Shabbat candles given to her? She extinguished the soul of Adam. Therefore was the precept of Shabbat lights given to her. So this, as I said, is an offensive text. It's a shocking text. We're not familiar really with this text. Kabad doesn't bring this text. Midreshet Torah doesn't bring this text. This is a text that is written at around 400 CE. There are several variations of this text, and it's an attempt to explain why certain mitzvot are being done by women through the lens of tikkun, of women atoning for sin that they brought into the world that corrupted Adam, the downfall from Eden, death, and so on and so forth. Very quickly, these sources disappear. They don't fully disappear. They remain in the midrashic collections, but they are not brought forth as the prominent reasons women do these mitzvot. And I believe that is because women themselves don't relate to these reasons. These are very othering reasons, very negative reasons, very harsh reasons. And if we look at Leah Cohn, she's an Eish Torah person. I brought this because I think some of what she's saying here reflects thousands of years of how women connect to mitzvot. And we may not have women's voices on these, but we certainly have the shadow or the sense of women's connection for thousands of years to mitzvot that they find spiritually meaningful, not as a tikkun, not as something that's meant to like correct for the soul of Adam, the dough of Adam, the light of Adam. What are you talking about? Women are doing these mitzvot because these are mitzvot that speak to their essence and their identity as women doing mitzvot. So let's take a look. These three mitzvot enable women to bring purity, light, and blessing into her surroundings. Why do women connect to the mitzvah of Shabbat candles? Even though, by the way, Shabbat candles is not fundamentally a woman's mitzvah. It's a mitzvah in the household. If a household is a household of men, then the men light the candles. It's not a woman's mitzvah. It becomes a woman's mitzvah because of its association of bringing light into the home. It's something that women are doing. And so then we look for meaning. The Midrash gives one meaning, a very dark meaning, a meaning that will not continue past the time in which the Midrash is written. Women are going to continue doing these mitzvot because bringing light into the home is what the Jewish wife and mother feels is her rightful role in this world. Challah, between you and me, men are taking challah more than women because bakers are male and they have the mitzvah of challah. But when we think of baking challah, we think of our bubby. We think of women for generations who nurtured and fed their family. Today, of course, challah baking is very popular in Hillel houses and Maishi houses and all sorts of places where men and women will make challah together. Whoever does the baking takes the challah, but it becomes a woman's mitzvah because of the sense of nurturing and feeding her household and bringing that blessing into her home. And the third one, which is mikvah, which is the ritual bath, water, that one is a woman's mitzvah. That one can only be done by a person with a womb who menstruates. But women who connect to the mitzvah, they connect to it because of the sense of water as renewal, as rebirth, as transformation, as purity, and they bring that back into the home. So I've brought you sources of othering, but I've ended with 3 mitzvot that while the Midrash tries to continue this othering, this distinction between male and female in a negative way, really very quickly women adapt and connect to these mitzvot because of section 2, wife and mother. And wife and mother is going to give women, Jewish women, a very significant role within society, community, and family that's going to some degree, maybe largely, balance out all of these sources that are about othering. The sources about othering are woman, capital W. The sources in section 2 are about wife and mother. And I'm going to hold those next to each other because I think it's really important to look at section 2, not as an apologetic, but coming from the same place. Women are here. Women are part of our society. Women are a little scary. They menstruate. They seduce us. Their sexuality is complex for us. But women are wives and mothers. And in those roles are something that are essential to our survival as a Jewish people. And we're going to see some very beautiful texts that I'm going to bring now in part 2. Okay. Shmot Rabbah. I'm going to continue drinking. Give me a moment. Okay. This is a really interesting source. And what's interesting, the Midrashim I'm bringing largely are between 400 and 800 CE in the land of Israel. So we're talking about the period of Amoraim, the Amoraic period of the Talmud, and the Gaonic period, the post-Talmudic period. That's the Midrash that I'm bringing. There are Midrashim that extend after that period of time, largely compilations that build on earlier Midrash and then vary. But I'm bringing what's considered to be like this classic period of Midrash between 400 and 800. What happens when the rabbis look at the story of Sinai is they realize that women are not explicitly at Sinai. They're just not there. Judith Plasko wrote a book called Standing Again at Sinai. She's a Jewish feminist scholar. And she says, where are the women? Before 1,200 years before Judith Plaskow, the Midrash Shmot Rabbah looks at the text and says, where are the women? We know that the men are told to separate from their wives. We know that the Bnei Yisrael are there, but the Bnei Yisrael largely refer to the men, unless it says Anashim V'Nashim, men and women. Because we know the Bnei Yisrael were 600,000, plus the women and children. So they know Bnei Yisrael are there, but where are the women? And it's inconceivable to the rabbis of the Midrash that the women are not there. It is inconceivable. Take a look. Ko tomar lebeit Yaakov. So we have a pasuk. Ko tomar lebeit Yaakov v'taged lebnei Yisrael. It's Exodus 19:3, right before Sinai. Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel. And the rabbis read that verse and they say, wait a minute, who are the Beit Yaakov? Who's the house of Jacob? It's very nice that it's literary, right? Like the Beit Yaakov, the Bnei Yisrael. But the rabbis go deeper. They say, look, we don't hear of the Beit Yaakov anywhere else. And we don't explicitly know that women are at Sinai. But we have a verse that includes Beit Yaakov and Bnei Yisrael. The Beit Yaakov are the women. We have found textual support to prove that the women are at Sinai because the Beit Yaakov are being presented as distinct from the Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael are the men, The Beit Yaakov are the women. That's how important it is to the Midrashic interpreters that the women be textually present at Sinai. Why were the women then addressed first? Because they are more diligent in the performance of mitzvot. What we're going to see in this section is the awareness that without the Jewish wife and mother, men are not going to be capable of continuing the covenant with God. It's really that simple. The men need the women to be their spiritual anchors. Now, I want to pause and say, this is a decision of rabbinic interpretation, right? The rabbis create a narrative in which wife and mother are going to be central for their survival and the continuity of the Jewish people. And one of the key decisions they make is matrilineal Judaism. And I don't have time to give you a whole historic overview of how we moved from patrilineal to patrilineal. Shai Cohen's book, The Beginning of Jewishness, is really an excellent resource if you want to map that out, and it's very readable. But it's unclear in the first, certainly in the Tanakh period, men are marrying non-Israelite wives and the children are Israelite. By the late Second Temple, we have moved towards matrilineal, and the rabbis come along and say, not only are we in favor, Jewish children will only be born out of Jewish wombs. And while today we might be back in a space where we wonder and question how we exclude certain people and include others, it is enormously important that they do this because it's going to stop men marrying out. And why is that important? Because we know from Ezra and Nehemiah, if men can marry out, they will. And then what will happen to our sisters? What will happen to our daughters? What role will the Jewish woman have if she's only a woman that he brings back to the tribe? By turning the Jewish womb into the only source of continuity, the Jewish wife and mother becomes as fundamental to the covenant as the circumcision on the body of the Jewish man. That is how the covenant is going to continue. And so now when we go back to the text, we recognize there's something brilliant in carving out such a significant religious and spiritual role for women. They are the continuity. They house within themselves the future of the Jewish people. In addition, we're going to start working on a narrative in which women are, at their essence, more spiritual than men. They might have brought down Adam in Eden, but we don't care about that narrative when we think about Eshet Chayil Miyimsad, the Eshet Chayil. What are we going to say? They are more diligent in the performance of mitzvot. Keep going. Another explanation, so that they should direct their children to the Torah. Rabbi Tachlif of Caesarea said, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, when I created this world, I first commanded Adam, and only afterwards was Eve commanded. However, she disobeyed and brought ruin to the world. That's my original sin. But we're going way past that. Now God says in this Midrash, if I do not call upon women first, they will render the Torah void. God auto-corrects. God says, I made a mistake in Eden. I went to Adam, and he told Eve, that was a mistake. But if I get buy-in from the women, what a powerful resource, what a powerhouse of commitment and engagement and spiritual aspiration, and that will spill over and affect the men. So that's what's happening here. It's very intentional and it's very deliberate and it's very significant because the Jewish wife and mother is going to be the cornerstone of the Jewish home, and she's going to be treated a certain way because of this discourse, this kind of discourse. It once happened that a pious man was married to a pious woman and they did not produce children. Said they, we are of no use to the Lord. Whereupon they divorced each other. The former went and married a wicked woman, and she made him wicked. While the latter married a wicked man, and she made him righteous. This proves it all depends on the woman. So while the first set of sources are about the othering, the second set of sources says, hey, women are going to be part of our lives, right? Let's look at the impact, the role, what a woman can do for us. And there's an awareness as men that they are weak, that there's a weakness in the man's character, that if he marries a woman who pushes him, who drives him towards the Torah halls and the synagogues, she supports his connection to Torah and mitzvot, then he will be a better person. The promise that the Holy One, blessed be He, made to women is greater than that which He made to men. As we read, tranquil women, arise, hear my voice, etc. By virtue of what deeds do women merit reward? By taking their children to the classroom, by sending their husbands to the house of study, by waiting for them until they return. Now, I want to say, I'm going to do two more sources, and then one more source, and then I'm going to pause. Genesis Rabbah, it is not good that the man should be alone. It was taught, he who has no wife dwells without good, without help, without joy, without blessing, and without atonement. So I'm going to pause. These are not apologetic sources. They might sound apologetic today from a modern feminist ear. This is like, what are you throwing me? But I want to go back 2,000 years. They don't know about apologetics. That would be anachronistic. What they are doing is shaping and defining and intentionally making room for the valorization, protection, significance of women within community. Not all religions, cultures, and communities are doing this. This is very significant in rabbinic Judaism, and it's going to continue to play out until today. In other words, certainly if we look at the Haredi community, Section 2 has tremendous import for how they look at the job of the Jewish wife and mother. And she takes that very seriously. And not in an apologetic way. She feels that is the essence of her character, and she leans into that, and this is who she feels, this is her avodat Hashem. We're now going to get to the section on mitzvot, but this continues to have resonance with many tens of thousands of Jewish women, maybe hundreds of thousands, however many it is, of Jewish women who see this as their responsibility in their avodat Hashem, in making sure their sons and their husbands are on the straight and narrow and are inspired and are supported towards what they have to do. I'll just pause and say, recently I was at a talk, it doesn't really matter, it had to do with the army and Haredim and so on. And there's a group of women in the national religious community who have spearheaded a grassroots campaign where they are trying to get out there as wives and mothers, saying our husbands and sons are doing insane amounts of reserve duty, are putting themselves in danger, we don't sleep at night, and we are appealing to you, the women of the Haredi community, to listen and hear as women what it means for us to send those most beloved to us out to fight while you get to go to sleep knowing your sons and your husbands are safe and are getting up and so on. So that's the campaign. I can send you, I don't know what it's called in English, but okay. There was an event on Sukkot in which two Haredi soldiers heard about the event, young men, I would say around 30, and came to the event. And in the course of the discussion with the national religious women who were there, and men, there were a few men, one of the questions that came up is why didn't more Haredim come to this event? Why couldn't we get more Haredim? And he said something really interesting. He said, you used the language shivyon banetel, equality in the burden. And he said that word shivyon, that word is an immediate off switch. It not only turns them off, it shuts them down. Equality does not exist as a value in the Haredi community. It does not exist as a value in rabbinic Judaism. It is not about equality. It is about each part of the community finding their or maximizing their avodat Hashem where they are. And so the Haredi community has no problem with the hierarchy of Kohen, Levite, Yisrael. Even among the men, there is not equality. There are men who are Torah scholars. The rabbis are an elite personas in their community. Women and men are different. They are not equal. They do not believe in equality. And so when I look at these sources, even today, Haredi women will not know what you're talking about if you say, come, let's talk about equality. You deserve more equality in the home. That is not a value They want to be fulfilled. They want meaning. They want love. They want respect. Many of them are in school. They want to be intellectually stimulated. They want to earn a living. All of that is true. But when you bring in the word equality, that is not something they can relate to. And so when we kind of in a modern feminist way, academic way, talk about, oh, these are so apologetic, they're just trying to make women feel good, that is unfair. That is an unfair definition, or really a diminishing of sources that have shaped and inspired and given identity for thousands of years to the Jewish wife and mother. We can now talk about, especially in part 3, what do we do for those women who no longer resonate with these kind of sources? That's an excellent question, and one that is worthy of asking. But despite part 1, part 2 are the more dominant, has a more dominant ripple effect, even though part 1 is a bit in the shadows, right? This idea of women as other and the threatening of female sexuality. Okay, part 3, and I know I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to get through this. Part 3 are really what I call the halakhic sources. Again, women are not equal to men. Women's obligations are not equal to men. And now let's look at what inequality and mitzvah obligation looks like. The man precedes the woman when it comes to choosing which will live in returning lost articles. And the woman precedes the man when it comes to clothing, support, and redeeming her from captivity. Why does a man, if I have to choose triage, I can only save a man or a woman? We save the man. He has more mitzvot. It's really that simple. It's a simple calculation. Who has more mitzvot? The man has more mitzvot. His life will come first. It doesn't mean we kill off the women. Please do not think that is all the case. No one wants the women to die. But I have 2 people drowning and I can only save one. Again, hopefully I can save both of them. The man comes first. Captivity, I can only save the man or the woman. I save the woman because she's more in danger of being sexually assaulted. And I take that very seriously. I'm not going to go into the last line. That requires more. When we talk about marriage, a woman is acquired. She is not acquired in the same way a cow or a piece of land or a servant or slave is acquired. Absolutely not. But she is acquired in the sense that her sexuality belongs only to her husband. That is really what's acquired. Within marriage, there are rights and obligations of both husband and men towards one another. I have studied the tractate Ketubot many times. It is one of my favorite tractates. I went into it at 21, 22 as a very angry feminist, and I came out of it recognizing that while, again, equality is not the value, a very balanced relationship in which women have rights and obligations and marriage and responsibilities, and men have rights and obligations and responsibilities is very dominant in the Talmudic text. Women are not chattel. Women are not to be used and objectified. Women have presence and women have agency, but it is not equal to that of men. Okay. All of the mitzvot that a father is commanded to do for his son, women are exempted from. All of the mitzvot the son is commanded to do for the father, women and men are equal. I don't have time to unpack this properly. I'll just say women are commanded in honoring their parents. The next piece of information I'm already saying is going to surprise and maybe upset some of you, and then I'll reframe it. Women were actually excused or exempted from honoring their parents once they were married. I go back to Ben Sira. Once a woman is married, her obligation, her fidelity has to be to her husband and the household they create together, certainly in the patriarchal world. A son, on the other hand, continues to be absolutely obligated to honor his parents until they die. And so that explains perhaps the sense of loss that when you marry off a daughter, she shifts her loyalties towards her husband. I will say in Ketubot, a man who prevents his wife from going to her parents is not a good husband, and she can be divorced from him even against his consent. So the rabbis are aware that a woman is connected to home, but they exempt her from honoring her parents because it may clash and conflict with her primary obligation as wife and mother. Today, in modern times, it is often the wife who cares for her aging parents or oversees the care, and sometimes of her aging in-laws, right? So we know that things have changed and the relationship between husband and wife is more of a partnership than a hierarchy. So, but it is interesting that the Talmud was sensitive to the the vulnerability of the wife or the vulnerability of the household. And so they exempt her even from one of the 10 commandments in order to facilitate shalom bayit, peace in the home. Another thing in this Mishnah, all of the positive time-bound commandments, men are obligated and women are exempt. All of the positive non-time-bound commandments, women and men are obligated. All of the negative commandments, men and women are obligated. So we end up with a platform in which men and women do not have equal obligation in mitzvot. However, this time-bound, non-time-bound has no clear textual basis. It appears only within the context of othering women in mitzvot. Dr. Judith Houtman says this very well. This whole idea of women in time-bound mitzvot, the time-bound mitzvot only appear to distinguish between men and women's obligation. We don't use it in any other case. It's not like we walk around, oh, that's time-bound and that's time-bound. It's only used to exempt women from a certain category of mitzvah. And so here we see an othering of women or a gender distinction that is definitely going to have impact. I will say in Kiddushin, and this is an important point, that is this a rule? What about matzah, joy on holidays, the public reading of the Torah every 7 years? Those are time-bound and women are obligated. What about learning Torah, procreation? Those are not time-bound and women are exempt. What's going on here? There are so many exceptions to the rule. Rabbi Yochanan says we don't learn from general principles and so on. So what I want to show you, which, I don't have here. Okay. When it comes to time-bound, non-time-bound mitzvot, women are exempted from something like 8 mitzvot. They're exempted from Shema. They're exempted from tefillin on the hand, tefillin on the head, tzitzit, shofar, lulav, sukkah, counting the omer, and going up for the pilgrimage festivals, 9. There are 9 mitzvot women are exempted from. They're obligated in a lot more. They're obligated in all Shabbat-based mitzvot that are time-bound, like Kiddush. They're obligated in all Passover time-bound mitzvot. They're obligated in Purim and Hanukkah. So going back to Houtman, it seems like the only purpose for the principle was to create a gender distinction and for men to emerge as more obligated. Perhaps another lecture, and I think it's a really fascinating, a part 2, is women and learning Torah and the whole trajectory, what happened from the Mishnaic time until today with ordination and how things changed. But that is really a separate lecture. Women were exempt from learning Torah, even though it was not time-bound. And really, that's a whole nother question, why that was and how that began to change in the 19th and 20th centuries. What I want to do in the short time I have left, I want to look at some of the reasons women. Okay, let me backtrack. Women were exempted from some time-bound mitzvot. I said something like 8. Nowhere in the Mishnah, nowhere in the Talmud, and not even in the Gaonim does anyone answer why. Not even in the early Rishonim, Maimonides, and so on. The first attempt to begin answering why are men. Okay, it's going to be men for a long time. And really, I'm going to start with the 13th century and then the 14th century, right? So it's going to be that men are going to begin to say, rabbinic men are going to say, wait, why were women exempt? But what's the reason? The Mishnah brings it as fact, but why? What about women? What about the essence or character of women led to them being obligated in less mitzvot? Now, if I had time, I would ask you, what have you grown up? Many people, especially if they've grown up in traditional communities, usually know 2 answers. Women are more spiritual than men, which, by the way, we saw in the Mishnah, the Midrash Shmot Rabbah, that women are more diligent in mitzvot. There, it wasn't being brought to answer why women have less mitzvot. It was answering why Beit Yaakov was addressed before the Bnei Yisrael, but okay, we pull that in. Women need less mitzvot, they're so spiritual. And the second is to take care of the children. Okay, these 8 mitzvot are going to get in the way of their taking care of the children. Let's take a look at what the men say, the early men. We'll start with the Abu Draham, 14th century Spain. This appears in another source in Ashkenaz, the Malmada Talmidim. Woman is exempt from positive precepts because she is bound to her husband to attend to his needs. Were a woman obliged to perform such mitzvot, her husband might bid her to do something at the precise moment that she is fulfilling one of these mitzvot. Should she fulfill the bidding of her creator and neglect her husband's demands, she faces her husband's wrath. On the other hand, should she fulfill her husband's demands and neglect the bidding of her creator, meaning God, she faces the wrath of her creator. Consequently, the creator exempted her. Now, this is a very 14th century source. It's concerned with Shalom Bayit. It's why women are exempted from honoring their parents, we said in the Talmud. And so it's not a bad suggestion. It's very reflective of the time. We're not interested in the children. We're interested in this dynamic between husband and wife, and that a woman has to show fidelity, loyalty. Her husband has to come first. And even mitzvot can't get in the way of that. And God understood that. Of course, God doesn't appear in any of these sources. We don't have a proof text with God saying this. Nonetheless, this is an attempt to answer the question. It is not fact or truth or the only interpretation. It's one interpretation. Rabbi Yoshua ibn Shuav has a different answer. Therefore, men bless every day that he has not made me a Kuthite, that he has not made me a slave, that he has not made me a woman. Because the souls of Israel are holier than that of the other nations, and from Canaanite slaves, and even from women. And even though women are relevant with regard to mitzvot, of course they have mitzvot, and they are from Israelite seed, their souls are not like the souls of men. So I'm bringing you two explanations that no one would bring today. One, that women are spiritually inferior, and the second is that women have to be free to serve their husbands. Okay? So it's legitimate for answers to shift and change as culture, education, reality changes. I'm just showing you that the earlier explanations had to do with husbands and spiritual inferiority, and not with what we like to bring today, which I think of as an apologetic spiritual superiority in children. Rabbi Hirsch already in the 19th century Germany, to his credit, he starts building elementary schools that are for boys and girls, that teach girls Torah as well. It's because of mandatory elementary education across Europe. Girls are being sent to the gymnasio, to the public schools, and boys are being sent to cheder, to the Jewish schools. And as a result, the girls are less interested, less connected. And of course, the emancipation, the Reformation, all of that's going on. And he basically says, I'll just read the last line. Women whose lifestyle does not subject them to comparable trials and hazards have no need for such reminders. He goes with men are out in the world, women are at home, and as a result, women need less mitzvot. It's not that they're spiritually superior, it's that they're less spiritually challenged. Now, this would be an easy one to knock off today because, of course, women leave the home and go out to all sorts of spiritual and religious challenges, secular colleges, the workplace, and so on. Rabbi Rachman, who I admire, both Rabbi Hirsch, Rabbi Rachman, he basically says women, by their very nature of their physical constitution and the requirements of law regarding their menstrual periods, needed little more to make them aware of the sanctity of time. Women need less mitzvot because they menstruate. And because in their menstruation, they're familiar with the holiness of time. I will say, it really does not resonate with me. And certainly the mitzvot around menstruation are extremely intricate and time-bound, but we'll put that on the side. These are attempts until the late 20th century of men to answer the question, why are women exempt? And we see it evolves from something negative to something more positive. And I didn't bring you some of the sources that say women are caring for the children, it's not their husbands, and women are more spiritually inclined. What I want to look at is women's voices. I should have just enough time. I'm going to bring Rachel Adler, Tamar Ross, and Blue Greenberg. A few rabbinic sources appear to have assumed that all the, I want to say Tamar Ross is a Haredi woman. She comes from the Haredi world. She is a feminist. She is a scholar. She's already retired. She has a PhD, Dr. Tamar Ross. And when she writes her book, Expanding the Palace of Torah, a whole uproar ensues in Orthodoxy because she dares to question the gender balance and where it comes from. A few rabbinic sources appear to have assumed that all the commandments were at the outset addressed only to men. This would mandate examining each mitzvah separately in order to see whether it might apply to women as well. In the course of such discussions, which display a more gender-based legislative bias, women's obligations usually appear as an addendum or as an exception to the male norm. Even including women in the religious obligations that apply on the holiday of Purim necessitate a special argument. They were witnesses to that miracle. The net result is that women are at times classified in halachic literature, together with other marginalized groups such as slaves, children, imbeciles, androgynes, hermaphrodites, and the deaf-mute, either because they are excluded from certain mitzvot or because they are merely exempt. Tamar Ross comes along as a learned woman and she says, whoa, I am not willing to ignore section 1 that I brought. I am not willing to ignore the othering. I'm not willing to ignore the hierarchy and the power dynamics that are going on. And we are going to name it. And women are at times put together with marginalized groups in order to exempt them from certain ritual obligations. As further examples will demonstrate, men's greater religious obligations, whether or not they are actually fulfilled, confer legal privileges. By the same token, women's lesser obligations disenfranchise them in many areas. As in the case of other classes and so on, difference in religious responsibility then serves as rationale for women's diminished valuation. This causes an enormous uproar. How dare this woman from within Orthodoxy say such negative things about our wonderful tradition, our Eshet Chayil. We were protecting women. We love women. We support. We respect, and so on. And she comes along and says, some of that is true. Maybe much of it was true for a long time, but there is a power dynamic and a diminished valuation of women. And one of the big things, and one of the things she's fighting for in divorce, there's absolute inequality and power dynamics going on in divorce, etc. Rachel Adler. Rachel Adler is going to start, she is a Balat Tshuva. When she writes this, she leaves the Reform movement, she becomes Orthodox, and she goes back to the Reform movement, and we'll see in a moment why. Make no mistake, for centuries, the lot of the Jewish woman was infinitely better than that of her Jewish counterpart. She had rights which other women lacked until a century ago. The problem is that very little has been done since 1000 CE to ameliorate the position of Jewish women in observant society. Again, an educated, learned woman who is learning the sources, and she's saying, it was really great until 1000 CE, and then you guys dropped the ball. Moreover, it is both feasible and desirable for the community to begin educating women to take on positive time-bound mitzvot, etc., in which case these mitzvot would become incumbent. She leaves Orthodoxy for several reasons. I saw how rabbis manipulated halakhah to maintain their own power and to disempower women. I decided my life was too short to wait for them to take the legal risks that would be necessary to make changes. So then I want to bring Judith Blue Greenberg. We who are committed to traditional Judaism are standing today at the crossroads on the question of women. Feminism disturbs our previous equilibrium, for it makes a fundamental claim about women, contrary to the model generated by halakhah. She then talks about the differences between secular feminism, Jewish feminism. It's a very long article. On the whole, I believe a Jew has a better chance of living a worthwhile life if he or she lives a life according to halakhah. Therefore, I do not feel threatened when addressing the question of the new needs of women in Judaism, nor in admitting the limitations of halakhah in this area. Indeed, it is my very faith in halakhic Judaism that makes me believe we can search within it for a new level of perfection, as Jews have been doing for these 3,000 years. Excuse me 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to stop there. My apologies. I'm getting over a cold. I'd be happy to take some questions. I'm going to wrap up. Just give me.
No, that's I'm also getting over a cold, which you can probably hear from my voice. That was a lot for us to digest, and I was just wondering if you would be able to provide us with those source sheets. Would you mind giving it to me, if that's okay? Some people have asked about that.
Yes, I will be happy to give you source sheets.
Oh, she muted herself. Hold on.
Oh, am I unmuted now? Oh,
yes.
unmute. Okay. So I'm going to drop a link for anyone who's interested in more. This was really made up the first chapter of my book, and I'll drop it into the chat. But what I really wanted to show you, first of all, again, I'm not shying away from the complexity of a 3,000-year-old, 3,000 plus year old religion, and that it emerges from patriarchy. It does. It emerges from a society in which there's hierarchy and there's patriarchy, and men and women are different, and there's no aspiration towards equality. Nonetheless, I hope you also saw that rabbinic Judaism took great steps towards including and protecting women, even as they othered them, right? Even as there's an othering, there's an imbalance, but nonetheless, the Jewish wife, the Jewish mother has a significant role in Jewish society and is responsible to a large degree for the continuity of society. In the 20th century, we begin to question that paradigm. And that's where you're going to begin to get an angrier discourse demanding for equality, for overriding some of this hierarchy and power dynamic, even within Orthodoxy, certainly within the other denominations. I'll just say it took quite a long time for both the Reform and conservative movements to agree to ordain women. We live in the shadow or the aftermath of like, oh, there's so much egalitarianism, but it really was huge fights. Men did not want to let go of their power. It really was that simple. Why should the male rabbinic establishment want to share their sandbox? Limited resources, limited pulpits, and so on. So I've talked to women who kind of fought for ordination, particularly in the conservative movement. It was really ugly. It was really intense. And there were people who left JTS over it and so on. But the Reform movement also had several years of upheaval where men did not want to cede their dominance to women. So we are really products of the mid to late 20th century, where we were born into the aftermath of first wave and second wave feminism. But remember that Orthodoxy is concerned for preserving tradition. And the question of what to do with gender dynamic and gender roles is not a small one when we're looking forward towards maintaining a certain fidelity to what came before. So as I said, I'm now gonna stop here, and Gila, you'll tell me if there are any questions.
There are a few. So a few people commented, and to me this actually is quite personal. The person who is single, Jewish,
yes.
And what about the divorced woman, the widowed woman? The sages and the text are referring to, and you mentioned the married woman has a role and the wife has a role.
Yes.
About
excellent question. Beautiful question.
The other.
I understand. Yes. So I'll just say, yes, really, really important question and beautiful question, and thank you for asking. And I will say, of course, in traditional society, the idea of women more or less having one role, wife and mother, is dominant. It doesn't mean that widows and divorcees did not exist in traditional society. They did. It didn't mean that there weren't some protections for them, but largely the push was towards that role. Now we get to the 20th century, right? The mid to late and the 21st century. And we recognize, of course, that not everyone gets married, and I've become a fertility expert as well, in addition to other things I do, fertility and halakhah. We certainly know not everyone is able to have, or not everyone chooses to have children. And Jewish community and men don't get married. Not all men get married. We're definitely dealing, and this really could be half of a lecture, the question of the challenges when a binary community that is men, women, marriage are suddenly challenged by the challenges of modernity, which is non-binary, which is we have gay members of our society, we have couples who don't have children, we have people who don't get married, and how are we going to find room for them in society? I don't believe it's a God question. I believe God sees all of us where we are, and Judaism very strongly believes that individuals, right, are created in the image of God, and Jewish individuals have obligation and mandate and covenant regardless of whether they get married and have families. That's independent. As a society, what are we directing towards? And as a society, how are we including those who don't fit into the framework that we consider to be ideal? Those are important questions, and I think every community has been wrestling with them for the last 25, 30, 35 years, whether it's membership dues. One of the big fights I've seen is charging more for a single than for a couple. Absolutely, I know shuls are some shuls have been sensitive enough to rethink that, but there's been a lot of rethinking because the family is so central in Jewish, like in the Jewish paradigm. What do we do when people look differently and act differently and their lives take them? So that I think is an initial, really first answer.
So basically, I don't get out of doing mitzvot as a thing.
Absolutely not.
And how does this then further extend into gender roles today, where we consider binary, non-binary, and these modern phenomenons that are coming up?
Yeah, very, very good question also. So I think today, before I even go to non-binary and the gay community and queer community, even within the male-female partnerships, men and women are thinking more thoughtfully about who is doing what in the household. I use the word partnership, and that extends to mitzvah performance as well. I'll just share an anecdote. I tell it in my book. A friend of mine was divorced, and she, for many years, was performing the mitzvah, making kiddush and blessing the challah, lighting the candles. Now, she was obligated in those, but traditionally, she was very traditional. The man did it, and then she remarried. She remarried a widower, and she said to him, "Okay, now you can take over kiddush." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't really want to. I don't like wine. You've been doing it. Why don't you continue making kiddush?" Which she did. But there are these moments where people are rethinking the automatic roles men and women have around mitzvah obligation. And of course, if you have two men and two women or a non-binary couple, they are going to be thinking together, not based on gender, but on who wants which mitzvah or which role in the household. And I think that's wonderful. And there's nothing threatening about that. Meaning, individual, when we create something together as family or community, we could be thoughtful about how we divide up the performance of those rituals.
So I guess that also kind of builds on how does all of this lead into, and I guess you commented briefly that now that we are living in the shadow of egalitarianism and all of these phenomenon, but how does that together, how does this all fit in with liberal Judaism today?
Yeah, so I think the initial response of liberal Judaism, if I go back to the earlier in the 20th century, was to reject a lot, and now I feel there's a coming back to, and the idea that liberal Judaism has more flexibility with regard to the gender piece, but just because things were gender doesn't mean we need to throw them all out, right? I think one of the saddest things for me, and I've seen a little bit of a coming back to it, is that the other denominations kind of rejected mikvah because, oh, it's misogynistic and it's menstrual and it's patriarchal, and let's just get rid of that whole thing. And there's something very tragic to me, because if I think of a fundamental women's mitzvah, the mikvah is a woman. Now, many men use the mikvah also for spiritual reasons, but why are we denying women access to one of the most fundamental mitzvot? You can align it, you can frame it, you can think about how to implement it, but I think they went a little too far in rejecting. And now the question is, how do you bring back connection and engagement? And without ritual, it's not going to happen. People need rituals in order to feel there's something they're outputting, an energy they're outputting spiritually or religiously, identity, whatever word you want to use. And I do feel there is a coming back. I teach at Pardes. I see some of my students here. I have non-binary students and I have non-denominational students from all the different rabbinical schools. And I think, one of the strongest things are the do's. They may not want to do all the don'ts. They may not want to abide by all the don'ts, but certainly the do's are very powerful in terms of feeling that this religion is mine. And so I'm hoping liberal Judaism will continue in that direction.
You mentioned a book by Shai Cohen. Would you repeat it?
The beginning of Jewishness. I can put that in the chat also.
Thank you. I will send that as a link as well. So I really just want to thank you again for coming on.